All right, it's a Viva on the Street update. It's been a while, and it's been a while. This is now month 4, I believe. We are in month 4 of François Legault's 4-week curfew to flatten the curve. A 4-week curfew which was imposed in January 2021, nearly a year into the 2 weeks to flatten the curve so as not to overwhelm the healthcare facilities. The 4-week curfew was imposed in January 2021. We are now May 7th, 2021, 4 months in. And recall, for anybody who has been following my channel, following my Viva on the Streets update, the curfew, the 4-week curfew, was imposed to not overwhelm the hospitals during the holiday season, 1 year into the pandemic. When this 4-week curfew was imposed, I think we were in something like 250, maybe 300 ICU COVID patients, something like 600 hospitalizations. It was a little under 1,000, I think. We are now at a little over 100 patients in the ICU and a little over 500 hospitalizations 4 months in to the 4-week curfew. And instead of the curfew being gone like 3 months ago, the curfew's still in effect, except the benevolent leader, François Legault, extended the curfew initially to 9:30, brought it back to 8 o'clock, then brought it back to 9:30 when the daylight savings time hit, because science. Because we have 138 people in ICU with COVID-related illnesses, 500 some odd hospitalizations in a province of 8.5 million people. You know what's happened, by the way? And I want everyone to appreciate this who's watching this. Our government has weaponized our... that was me. Our government has weaponized our healthcare system. They have weaponized our healthcare system so that they can justify 130, 140 ICU patients, 500 hospitalizations to lock down a province of 8.5 million. Now, appreciate that, because instead of resolving what is clearly a problem, in that if our province cannot deal with these types of numbers, the problem is not necessarily the virus, but the healthcare system. And instead of resolving the problem, they are crushing the citizenry with one false promise after another. 2 weeks to flatten the curve, March 2020. 4-week curfew to not overwhelm the hospitals, January 2021. We are now May 7th, 2021. And it's endless. And not only is nobody... What are you doing? Not only is nobody asking, when is this going to end? You've got daytime radio saying that this shouldn't end. That unless we just follow the rules, this won't end. And the reason why it's still in effect is because we're not following the rules. They're actually, in a way, in every abusive relationship, blaming the victim for the abuse of the victimizer. So now we are in month 4 of the 4-week curfew, year 2 of the 2-week lockdown. Our governments, instead of actually resolving the problem, which is clearly a defective healthcare system, they are just stripping Canadian citizens of their most basic and fundamental civil rights. Which brings us into one of the updates of the Viva on the Street. Pastor James Coates. For those of you who don't know, Pastor James Coates is the pastor of the Grace Life Church in Alberta, who was arrested and imprisoned for 35 days because he did not shut his church down in accordance with the edicts that were issued under the Health Act in Alberta. He was imprisoned for 35 days for infractions which themselves never carried any jail time. He was imprisoned for 35 days because he refused to adhere to the social distancing guidelines during service, the capacity limits during service. And he was issued some tickets and he was arrested, but he refused to sign the bail conditions to be released. And so they refused to release him. And so the idea is that you can be imprisoned for violating your bail conditions, even if the underlying infractions issued under the Health Act, whatever it is, the Public Health Act in Alberta, did not themselves carry jail time. He was in jail for 35 days, and it should be added, by the way, the first 2 weeks of that, from what I understand, were in some form of solitary confinement because it's COVID. You have to be isolated in a new environment to make sure that you are not contaminated and you don't contaminate other people. So he was effectively in solitary for 2 weeks while he was locked up for 35 days because of an underlying health violation accusation. He was ultimately, incidentally, released because the Crown dropped all but one of the charges. So, locked up in jail for 35 days only for the Crown to drop all but one of the charges. The JCCF, which is the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, who are representing him, their position was that they insisted that one charge be left so that they can actually have a trial on that charge and force the Crown to make its evidence. I suspect the Crown would say, we left one charge so that we could have our victory too. The update, Pastor Coates had his trial start, I think it was on May 3rd. And so he had a couple of days of trial, and based on some reporting from Rebel Media, Ezra Levant, and by the way, go support them if you can because they are being dealt the hand that the social media overlords deal people like Ezra Levant and entities like Rebel Media. According to the reporting, at one point during the trial, when the health director or whomever had to justify why they showed up with armed police guards to make the arrests when Pastor Coates was nothing but a passive, compliant accused, apparently they said they did it for the media. They did it for the exposure. They did it for the impression that it would give. So they've had 2 days of trial from what I've been reading in terms of the summaries from the JCCF bulletins. And apparently the judge said, we have 3 questions. Were Pastor Coates' rights violated? If they were violated, were they justified for health or scientific reasons? I forget the first question, but it was an academic question. And they've paused the trial pending a determination on whether or not the court comes to the conclusion that Pastor Coates' civil rights, charter rights were violated. I think it's a no-brainer that they will come to that conclusion. But then the issue is going to be, if they come to that conclusion that yes, his civil rights were violated, then they're going to have a second portion of the trial, which is going to be whether or not that violation was justified under the charter, justified under the rules of a free and democratic society. So apparently the trial has been continued to June 7th, I think. I may be wrong on some of these details, but I'm not sure that I am, so whatever. But this is the amazing thing. Earlier this week, I did a live stream with an RT journalist. Yes, he's a journalist for Russia Today or Russian television, whatever RT stands for. It has the word Russian in it. Oi, get over here, stop it. George Samueli, journalist for RT, author of the book Bombs for Peace, how NATO's humanitarian war in Yugoslavia. I screwed up the title, but that's what the book is about. And George was talking about Navalny, the Russian opposition politician who's been jailed by Putin, and the trial that he went through in Russia. And it was a trial which the European Tribunal for Human Rights, whatever, the European Commission for Human Rights, said was an unlawful trial that violated Navalny's human rights. And I asked George Samueli about this, and he said, the trial was okay, implicitly recognizing that there were aspects of the trial that were not okay, but by and large it was okay. And I saw people in the chat of the stream, immediately accusing George Samueli, journalist for RT, of being a Russian apologist. And I spent the next day reflecting on this, and I was just thinking, not that George Samueli is necessarily right or wrong, not that Putin is good, not that the trial was fair, just that who in God's name are we to be judging these foreign countries when this is what we are doing in our own country? We imprisoned, locked up a pastor for 35 days in jail, 2 weeks of which was solitary confinement, for a health violation and bail conditions, the health violations which never carried any jail sentence. And we're going to sit here and judge Putin and judge Russia and judge the validity of the trials in Russia when we're basically conducting our own Russian-esque type trials here? Who are we to judge? It's nice that we judge foreign dictatorships, foreign tyrannies, and say how bad they are and how evil they are and how corrupt the system is. And it's actually just a distraction from our own wrongdoings here. It's very easy, like a child, just to point the finger somewhere else and say, look how bad they are. Meanwhile, we are literally locking up pastors for a month in solitary confinement because they conducted church services. And incidentally, funny thing, the entire church now has been shut down, barricaded off with armed police guards. They put a porta potty apparently on the front steps of the church. And Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, who barely 3 years ago was tweeting out accusing and criticizing the Chinese government of oppression, criticizing communism by praising people who formed a human shield around a church that the Chinese Communist government was trying to shut down. 3 years ago, Jason Kenney was criticizing the Chinese government for what they were doing, criticizing communism and praising people who formed a human shield around a church. 3 years later, he is literally locking up pastors and blocking off a church with a barricade and police presence. But yeah, we can go ahead and judge other countries very harshly because it's a deflection from our own governmental wrongdoings. That is the biggest update. This dog has seen something that he needs to go see. It's an atrocious situation. And it's now, what time is it? I guess it's 9:30. The curfew is in effect now, but I'm allowed out because I have a dog. And nothing. People have just come to accept this as though this is somehow not that bad. I got into a bit of a Twitter spat with someone who dared to attack me because I was complaining about this.
Oh, what, you're a whiny
and they said,
baby.
How dare you complain? This isn't Nazi Germany. This isn't X, Y, and Z. And I was like, well, that's one heck of a low bar that we've set now, that unless it's Nazi Germany, I can't complain. I can't complain that we have a curfew in effect for 4 months and it's become an indefinite curfew. I can't complain that people do not have the right to worship freely. I'm not even a religious person. But if someone's going to tell me that I should be grateful that this is what our society has become, we're locking up pastors, blocking off churches, locking people in their homes for the better part of days, shutting down businesses, requiring children to wear masks, requiring adults to wear masks outdoors if they're nearer than 2 meters to each other, despite all the science. Someone's going to say, I have nothing to complain about because it's not Nazi Germany. Sorry, I have higher standards for my country. I have higher standards which have been systematically violated by the existing governments and even by the opposition governments. Sorry, I'm not as crazy as I look, by the way. I'm just... It is absolute madness. It's madness, and at some point it's going to get so mad that even the silent majority in the middle who don't want to stick their necks out and who don't want to raise their voices are going to stick their necks out and raise their voices. And that's what it's going to take before these politicians finally respond to what is over the top. It's not just a nanny state. It's not just a daddy state. It is an oppressive state. It's an oppressive state where we have no freedoms but for that which is gifted to us by the government, and that is exactly the opposite of what it should be. Okay, I don't know what the dog's eating, but I think we're done now. That is the Viva on the Street update / rant. I hope you enjoyed it. More important than that, I hope my camera is still recording because I haven't seen the front of this camera in a while. That being said, a little bit of optimism. I've said it before. It's always darkest before dawn? I don't know. The point is, it has to get so bad that even the people who have been saying for the last year it's not so bad finally wake up and recognize that it's bad. It's too bad and it's beyond bad. And may there be a reckoning at the polls the next election if the government ever decides to call one. Who knows? Who knows? We may just never be able to have another safe election again because COVID. I'm being sarcastic and tongue-in-cheek, but that is the Viva on the Street update. Don't lose faith. Don't get complacent. And protest in a manner that is productive, not counterproductive, and that actually gets you to go where you want to go and does not exacerbate the situation. With that said, peeps, peace out.